The sound of the notification came at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, exactly 2 hours and 47 minutes after I dropped my wife at the departures curb of O'Hare International Airport. I remember the time precisely because I'm the kind of person who remembers times. Details matter in my line of work. When you spend your days tracing money through the financial system, finding the threads that unravel millions, discovering the offshore account buried 3 shell corporations deep, you learn to live by numbers, dates, times, sequences. My phone buzzed against the mahogany of my desk. The notification was from the Ring doorbell at my brother's place. Motion detected. Timestamp, 2:47 p.m. I clicked on it. High-definition video. I watched a figure walk toward my brother's front door, a woman with dark hair, wearing the navy blazer I recognized, carrying the black roller suitcase that was supposed to be on a plane to Chicago. My wife, Clara, slid a key into my brother's lock. Not a knock, a key. She turned the handle and disappeared inside. I didn't move for 43 seconds. My brain was already doing what it does best, cataloging details, filing them, creating a sequence. When you're a forensic accountant, you understand that the best lies are built on small truths. A key given freely is a key given for a reason. I scrolled back through the camera footage. 10 days of nothing. Then the pattern started. Clara going to client dinners. Nathan mentioning hanging out with a friend. The Ring footage showing Clara's car pulling up to his place each time. Once she let herself in with that key. Once Nathan had been outside looking at something on his phone, and he glanced over his shoulder before stepping back inside with her. My phone buzzed. A text from Clara. Just landed in Chicago, exhausted from the flight, going to the hotel to freshen up before the cocktail hour. Miss you. Talk later? I stared at those words. Miss you, she wrote. The text message was sent from her phone at 4:13 p.m. At 4:13 p.m., Clara was probably not in Chicago, probably not in an airplane. I typed back, safe travels, babe. Sounds like a good plan. I'll be here. I didn't call her. I didn't confront her. I began to think like a forensic accountant thinks. The calculation comes first. I went to my basement study, the real one, the one with the safe room, the one no one else knew about. Concrete walls, no windows, a biometric lock. I'd installed it 3 years ago after a case that exposed how vulnerable financial data could be. Clara thought I'd converted the basement into a wine cellar. I'd let her think that because there's a difference between secrecy and privacy, and I'd been living in that difference for years without knowing it. Inside, I had the hardware, a computer disconnected from any home network, protected by multiple layers of encryption. I sat down and booted up the system. I have 8 primary accounts. 3 are joint accounts with Clara. 5 are in my name only. 2 of those are offshore accounts in the Caymans and Bahamas. Perfectly legal, perfectly documented. The combined balance was $7.3 million, money that I had earned through legitimate work. But the offshore accounts contained the type of money that makes people curious, like an unfaithful wife and a desperate younger brother. I began to modify the account structure. What I did was create a secondary verification protocol. I added a 2-factor authentication step that required a token I kept with me at all times. I added it in such a way that the notification would be filtered into a separate email folder, one that only appeared if you knew where to look. It was like putting a tripwire in a dark hallway. It wouldn't stop someone from entering, but it would let me know when they did. Then I created a transaction alert on a new account, the decoy account. I transferred $500,000 from my legitimate offshore account into this new account. I set it up with all the legitimate infrastructure. I linked my official business emails. I created transactions that referenced real work. I made it look like the kind of account I would have. Then I made the critical alteration. I set the transaction alerts to my old phone number, a number I deactivated 3 years ago, but was still technically registered. The alerts would log, but they wouldn't actually send to me. They would go nowhere. I was building a maze. I was constructing a box for them to fall into, and I was doing it in a way that would look, from the outside,
like the kind of security someone with my expertise would maintain, which meant they would know exactly how to circumvent it, or at least they would think they did.
By 3 a.m., the house was completely silent. There was no sound except the mechanical hum of the computer and the sound of rain starting to fall outside. October rain in Chicago sounds like an ending. I closed the computer and went back upstairs. I got into the bed where my wife wasn't sleeping. The next morning, I called my IT person, a guy named Derek who worked freelance. "I need you to monitor some accounts," I said. "I need you to see if anyone's trying to access them, not in an obvious way, the kind of thing that a person with some knowledge might try." Derek understood immediately. He'd worked with me before on cases where I was building evidence. "I can set up a honeypot account, make it look real, monitor access attempts." "I already have the bait set up," I said. "I need you to monitor it. Send me the details. I can have something in place by this evening." I spent the next week pretending everything was normal. Clara texted me from Chicago. I texted her back. We had phone calls. She described the conference, the women she'd met, the insights she'd gained. She told the story seamlessly, with the kind of detail that made it feel real. And I listened and asked questions at the right moments and played the role of the husband she was deceiving. Meanwhile, I was working on the Meridian Digital case. I'd found that their controller had been embezzling money, about $340,000 over 3 years. When I presented my findings to the CFO, his face went through several stages of color. "How did you find this?" he asked me. "I was looking for it," I said. The complete answer was, "I know exactly how people hide money, because I understand that money is like a language they speak with an accent. You can hear where they come from. You can trace the path of their thoughts by following the path of their finances." That night, after the office, I went home. I made dinner for myself, grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, a glass of wine. I sat at the dining table, the long, elegant table Clara had chosen, and I ate alone while texting with my wife. "How's day 2 of the conference?" I typed. "Amazing. Just came from a panel on fintech innovation. There's this woman from Singapore who's created a platform for cross-border payments that doesn't require a central bank. Absolutely revolutionary." "Sounds incredible," I typed back. "You're in the right place." This was the dance. This was the pretense. Each message was me deciding to play along, to give them space, to let them think the plan was working. And all the while, my mind was working on something else entirely. At 11 p.m., I went back down to the basement office. I had the account access credentials memorized. I had backup authentication codes written down in a cipher only I could read. I had the hardware token that generated the secondary password for my offshore accounts sitting in a physical safe that only I could access. I logged in. The first thing I did was review the transaction history. No unusual activity. That was good. If they were going to try to drain the account, they would do it carefully. That was where I could set my trap. By Friday night, I was ready. I called Derek. "Any activity?" I asked. "Nothing yet, but they're preparing. I can feel it. They've been poking around, testing the waters." Saturday morning, I prepared my own case against myself. I created a comprehensive financial document showing the transfers from my accounts. I documented the offshore account activity. I compiled everything that would make me look guilty. Then I included detailed notes explaining exactly why I had set this up as a trap. I sent it all to my lawyer, David Chen, confidential, attorney-client privilege. When David called me, his voice was very careful. "Elias, what in God's name is going on?" he asked. "My wife and my brother are committing fraud against me," I said calmly. "They've transferred funds from accounts I set up as a trap. I've documented everything, and I need your help to make sure that when this goes to law enforcement, I'm not the one who looks guilty." There was a long silence. "You need to call the police," David said finally. "Not yet," I said. "I need to understand the full scope first. I need to let them think they've succeeded, because right now they've committed fraud against me. But if I move too quickly, they might have already prepared something, some false accusation, some counter-narrative.
I want to make sure they fully committed before I pull the trigger. That's a dangerous game, David said. I know, I said, but I'm good at games. We spent 2 hours going through everything. By the end, David understood what I was doing. You're building a case, he said, not just against them, but for yourself. You're making sure that when this goes public, there's no ambiguity about what happened. Exactly, I said. Over the next week, I watched and waited. Clara came home each day and seemed fine, normal. She didn't act like someone who just committed fraud. She didn't seem nervous or guilty or aware that she was being monitored, which meant she genuinely believed that what they'd done was untraceable, that they'd covered their tracks so well that I would never find out. Wednesday night, Derek called. They're back, he said. Same pattern, different amount. How much? I asked.
They just transferred another $300,000, split between 3 accounts this time. Looks like they're getting more confident. The routing is less careful. The shell companies are lazier. They think they're safe, I said. Apparently, Derek said. By October 24th, they'd stolen $740,000 from the decoy account. The real total was $500,000. That's all I'd put in there. But the way they'd structured the transfers, the way they'd routed the money through different accounts and shell companies, it created the appearance of a much larger theft, which was perfect. Because here's what they didn't understand. I wasn't actually concerned about the money. I had plenty of money. What I was concerned about was the pattern. Every transfer they made created evidence. Every routing created a digital trail. Every shell company they used created documentation. And most importantly, every transfer used my credentials, my username, my passwords, my digital signature, which meant that to law enforcement, it would look like I was transferring my own money. It would look like I was trying to hide assets. It would look like I was committing fraud against my own accounts, which made no sense, which made it suspicious, which made it exactly the kind of thing that would trigger an investigation into whether I was actually the victim or actually the perpetrator. And that's when I was going to provide the documentation of my trap. That's when I was going to explain, with total clarity, what had actually happened. On October 24th, I went to my bank and requested detailed statements for the past 3 months. I requested records of every login to my offshore accounts. I requested a complete audit trail of every transaction. The bank manager looked at the request and asked if there was a problem. I want to be thorough, I said. I want to make sure there's no unauthorized activity on any of my accounts. I can have the IT department pull all of that, he said. When do you need it? As soon as possible, I said. I'm concerned about potential fraud. By that evening, I had received the complete transaction history. I printed it out. I highlighted the unusual transfers in red. I created a document that showed with absolute clarity exactly when the fraudulent transfers had occurred and where the money had gone. Then I called the Chicago Police Department. Specifically, I called the Financial Crimes Unit and asked to speak with a detective. A woman named Detective Sarah Morris called me back. Mr. Holloway, I understand you may have information about a financial crime. I do, I said, but I need to explain something first. I'm a forensic accountant. I understand how fraud works, and I understand how investigations work. What I'm about to tell you might sound complicated, but I've documented everything, and I'm happy to walk you through it. Go ahead, Detective Morris said. I spent the next 40 minutes explaining the situation. I told her about the decoy account. I told her about the transfers. I told her about the pattern of fraud. I told her about my wife and my brother's involvement. When I was done, Detective Morris was quiet for a moment. You set up a trap, she said finally. I did, I said. With your own money. Money I could afford to lose. I wanted to gather evidence before I reported it. I wanted to make sure I understood the full scope of what they were planning. Okay, Detective Morris said. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to need you to come in and make a formal statement. I'm going to need copies of all of this documentation, and I'm going to need you to understand that we are now part of the investigation, which means you cannot discuss this with anyone. Not your wife, not your brother, not your lawyer. My lawyer already knows, but I haven't told my wife or my brother. Keep it that way, Detective Morris said. We're going to need to do this carefully. We need to see what they do next. We need to gather more evidence while we're actively monitoring their activity. How long will that take? I asked.
Could be weeks, could be months, but we'll be thorough. And when we move, we'll have everything we need. The next 2 weeks were, in some ways, the hardest part of the entire ordeal. I went to work, I came home, I made dinner with Clara, I slept next to her, I lived in the same house, breathed the same air, existed in the same space as someone who was actively conspiring against me, and I said nothing. It was like being two different people simultaneously. One version of me was the husband, engaged, present, attentive. The other version was somewhere else entirely, existing in a place where I could see everything clearly, where the betrayal was so obvious that it seemed insane that anyone could fail to notice it. But that was the thing about betrayal. It was invisible to everyone except the person who was being betrayed. Clara had no idea that I knew. Clara had no idea that the police were monitoring her activity. Clara had no idea that every transaction she made was being cataloged and documented and prepared as evidence. On November 3rd, exactly 2 weeks after the first transfer, I came home to find Clara packing. "I have to go back to New York for work," she said, not looking at me as she folded clothes into a suitcase. "It's a last-minute thing, client emergency. I'll be gone for maybe 3 days."
"What kind of emergency?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. "They're restructuring their marketing team, and they want my input on the creative strategy," she said. "I know it's last minute, but they're paying well, and I couldn't say no." "When are you leaving?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Early flight. I'm sorry I didn't give you more notice." I nodded. "Of course, do whatever you need to do." That night, I called Detective Morris. "She's going to New York," I told her. "Tomorrow morning." "We know," Detective Morris said. "We've been monitoring her communications with your brother. We think they're planning something big. We think they're about to move the money again, probably to accounts that are harder to trace." "What do you want me to do?" I asked. "Nothing," Detective Morris said. "Let her go. Let them execute whatever plan they have. We'll be watching the entire time." The next morning, I drove Clara to the airport. We sat in traffic on the Kennedy Expressway, and she talked about the New York client, about what she was hoping to accomplish, about when she'd be back. I held her hand and said the right things, and inside I was somewhere else entirely. When I dropped her at departures, she kissed me goodbye. "I'll text you when I land," she said. "Safe travels," I told her. Then I watched her walk into the airport with her suitcase, and I didn't feel anything. She texted me at 10:47 a.m. "On the plane. Miss you already." At 3 p.m., Detective Morris called me. "Your wife just boarded a flight, but not to New York," she said. "The flight went to Miami. She's currently sitting in the Miami airport, and we have agents following her." "What's in Miami?" I asked, although I already knew the answer. "We think it's where your brother and she are planning to meet," Detective Morris said. "We think they're planning to move the money again. We think they're planning to leave the country." My hand went cold. "What do we do?" I asked. "We wait," Detective Morris said. "We let them commit the crime. We let them make their move. And then we arrest them at the border before they can leave the country with the stolen funds." Within 3 hours, Nathan had boarded a flight from Chicago to Miami. Within 6 hours, both he and Clara were in a hotel in South Beach, registered under false names, but identified by the FBI agents who were actively tracking their movements. I sat in my office at work, the office with the view of Lake Michigan, and listened as Detective Morris explained everything in real time. "She's meeting with someone," she said. "We believe it's Marcus Chen, the accountant who's been helping them. He just arrived at their hotel." "What are they doing?" I asked. "We can't know for sure from here, but based on the pattern, we think they're finalizing the transfer of the money to accounts that will be difficult to locate. We think they're planning to disappear." "And then what?" I asked. "And then we arrest them," Detective Morris said, "when they try to cross the border, if they try to cross the border. Or if we get enough evidence of the crime, we arrest them now, but I'd like to give them a little more rope." That night, I went home to an empty house. I cooked dinner for one. I sat at the table where we'd sat together countless times and ate alone. And I thought about the moment when all of this had started, the moment when the doorbell camera had pinged with the image of my wife entering my brother's apartment.
If I'd handled it differently, if I'd confronted them immediately, maybe some part of this could have been saved. Maybe there could have been apologies and explanations and some kind of reconciliation, even if the marriage never recovered. But I hadn't done that. I'd done what I do best. I'd analyzed the problem, I'd identified the weak points, I'd constructed an elegant trap. And now, two people who had been part of my life for years were about to have their lives destroyed by the consequences of their own choices. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt nothing at all except a kind of deep, resonating sadness. The next morning, November 4th, Detective Morris called me at 6:47 a.m. "They're on the move," she said. "Your wife and brother just left the hotel. They're heading to the airport." "They're leaving?" I asked. "Looks like it," Detective Morris said. "We're going to let them get to the gate. We want them to have purchased their tickets. We want them to have moved through security. We want to maximize the charges we can bring against them." "What if they get on a plane?" I asked. "They won't," Detective Morris said. "We'll stop them before that happens, but we need to give them every opportunity to commit the crime. That's how we ensure a conviction." I went to work. I sat at my desk. I tried to focus on work, but I couldn't. I kept thinking about Clara going through security at the Miami airport. I kept thinking about Nathan beside her, probably nervous, probably excited, thinking about the life they were about to start in whatever country they'd chosen. At 2:13 p.m., my phone rang. Unknown number. "Mr. Holloway, this is Special Agent David Torres with the FBI. I'm calling to inform you that your wife, Clara Holloway, and your brother, Nathan Holloway, have been taken into federal custody at Miami International Airport. They are being charged with wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and money laundering. You will likely be contacted for a statement within the next 24 hours. After I hung up, I sat in my office with the view of Lake Michigan and felt the weight of everything settle on my shoulders. It was done. Over the next few days, the full scope of what Clara and Nathan had done became clear. They'd stolen $740,000 from my decoy account, but more importantly, they'd attempted to steal significantly more from my real accounts. The access they'd gained through the credentials I'd intentionally left vulnerable to them had allowed them to see the full extent of my wealth. What they had found was approximately $7.3 million in total assets. Their plan had been ambitious. They were going to transfer the entire amount to offshore accounts in the Caymans and Bahamas, make it look like I had stolen the money, and then report me to law enforcement. In the chaos of the investigation, while I was dealing with federal fraud charges, they were planning to disappear with the assets. It was genius in a strange way. It would have worked on most people. It would have worked on anyone who didn't understand how money moved, how fraud worked, how the digital trail never lies to someone who knows how to read it. But it hadn't worked on me. The evidence I'd gathered during those 2 weeks, the monitoring data, the digital footprints, the detailed transaction history, the backup communications between Clara and Nathan, was, according to Detective Morris, the cleanest financial crime case I've ever seen. Usually, she told me, these cases are messy. People don't keep good records. They say things verbally. There's ambiguity. But you documented everything. You created a clear chain of evidence. You made their guilt impossible to dispute. "Will they take a plea?" I asked. "Almost certainly," Detective Morris said. "Given the evidence, their lawyers would be advising them that trial is not a viable option. A plea deal would be much better for them." I nodded, but I wasn't thinking about plea deals. I was thinking about the moment when Clara had kissed me goodbye at the airport. I was thinking about the moment when I'd driven home to an empty house. I was thinking about 8 years of a life that had been a lie built on top of another lie, like layers of fraud going all the way down. On November 8th, I received a call from Marcus Chen's lawyer. Chen was willing to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. He was willing to provide documentation of every offshore account he'd set up for Clara and Nathan. He was willing to testify about their instructions to him, their timeline, their plans. The case was essentially over. What remained was the final act, the courtroom where the consequences would be formally imposed. The trial date was set for March 18th. That gave us 4 months,
4 months during which I had to decide what I actually wanted to happen. 4 months to think about my wife sitting in a federal detention facility. 4 months to think about my brother in a cell. I should have spent those months preparing my testimony. Instead, I spent them trying to remember who I was before all of this happened. It didn't work. By the time March 18th arrived, I was someone new. I was someone who understood that the architecture of trust was built on lies, that every relationship was a performance, that the only person you could ever really trust was the person looking back at you in the mirror. The courthouse was a monument to federal power. Stone, glass, the kind of building designed to make ordinary people feel small. I arrived at 8:47 a.m. and immediately the prosecutor, a woman named Helen Vasquez, pulled me aside. They rejected the plea deal, offered them 5 to 7 years. They're going to trial instead. This surprised me. I assumed they would take the plea, would accept the inevitable. But I should have known better. Clara had never admitted defeat. That was part of what made her so dangerous. Why? I asked. Their lawyer thinks they can create reasonable doubt. He's going to argue that you fabricated the evidence. He's going to say that you set them up, that you manufactured the transactions to frame them for a crime they didn't commit. I felt something shift in my chest. This was it. This was the moment where the game entered a new phase. Can he make that argument stick? I asked. Not if you testify correctly, Helen said. The evidence is airtight. But Clara's lawyer is good. He's going to try to make the jury think that you're a scorned husband, that you're lying to cover up your own infidelity, that you set a trap because you were jealous of your brother. We went through the prosecution strategy. Helen would present the financial evidence, Derek would testify about the monitoring system, the bank manager would present the transaction records, then I would take the stand. Don't volunteer information, Helen told me. Answer the questions I ask. Don't try to explain too much. Let the evidence speak for itself. I nodded. I understood. I'd spent my career understanding how to tell a story with numbers. Now it was time to tell the story with words. The trial began with opening statements. The prosecution laid out the case methodically. She talked about the pattern of fraud. She talked about the offshore accounts. She talked about the evidence that would prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Clara and Nathan had conspired to steal money. Then Clara's lawyer, a man named Richard Shelton, stood up. He was good. I could see that immediately. He had the kind of presence that made people listen. He wore an expensive suit. He moved with confidence. What the prosecution has presented to you, he said, is a carefully constructed narrative designed to hide the truth. The truth is that the defendant, Clara Holloway, is an innocent woman who has been framed by her own husband. The truth is that the evidence you will see has been manufactured. The truth is that the real criminal in this case is the prosecution's star witness, Elias Holloway, a man who, by his own admission, set a trap designed to frame his wife and brother. He walked across the courtroom slowly, letting his words sink in. Elias Holloway is a forensic accountant. He understands financial systems. He understands how to hide money. He understands how to create false evidence. And he did all of that to get revenge on a wife who had strayed from their marriage. It was brilliant. It was also false, but it was the kind of false that could feel true if you didn't look too carefully. Over the next 3 days, the prosecution presented its case. Derek testified about the monitoring system, the bank manager presented the transaction records, the FBI agent described the arrest at Miami International Airport.
Each testimony was a stone in a wall. By the time they finished, there was a solid structure of evidence. Then it was time for me to take the stand. I walked to the witness stand. I placed my hand on the Bible. I swore to tell the truth. Helen approached me with her first question. Mr. Holloway, can you describe your relationship with your wife? We were married for 8 years, I said. I thought we were happy. And your relationship with your brother? We were close, or I thought we were. Helen walked me through the discovery, the doorbell camera, the pattern of visits, the subsequent financial fraud. She asked me about the decoy account, and I explained my reasoning. I wanted to understand the full scope of the conspiracy, I told her. I wanted to gather evidence before going to the authorities. I wanted to make sure that when the truth came out, it was absolutely clear what had happened. Did you fabricate any of the evidence? Helen asked. No, I said. Everything is documented. Every transaction is real. Every routing is traceable. Helen finished her questioning, and Richard Shelton approached for cross-examination. This was when things got interesting. Mr. Holloway, he said, you describe yourself as a forensic accountant. You understand financial systems very well, don't you? Yes, I said. In fact, you're so skilled at understanding financial systems that you could, if you wanted to, create false transactions. You could make it look like someone stole money when they actually didn't, couldn't you? Technically, yes, I said, but I didn't do that. How do we know? Shelton asked. How does this jury know that you didn't create this entire scheme to frame your wife and brother? I took a breath. This was the moment. This was the question I'd been preparing for without knowing it. Because, I said carefully, I can prove it. Shelton's expression changed slightly. A flicker of concern crossed his face. What do you mean you can prove it? He asked. I mean, I said, that I documented everything, not just the fraud, but the trap itself. I created a record of when I set up the monitoring system. I created a record of when I transferred money into the decoy account. I documented my own actions. But couldn't you have created false records of your own actions? Shelton pressed. I could have, I said, but I also did something else. I sent those records to my lawyer before any of this happened. I sent them to him under attorney-client privilege, which means they're contemporaneous. They're dated. They prove that I set up the trap before Clara and Nathan ever stole anything. I saw the calculation in Shelton's eyes. He was realizing that he'd walked into a box. In addition, I continued, I contacted the police before the fraud was fully executed. I provided them with the monitoring data, the account information, all of the evidence. Detective Morris can testify that I came to her on October 24th, before Clara and Nathan even attempted to access the Miami airport. That's not something a man who fabricated evidence would do. Shelton tried a different approach. You set a trap for your wife because you were jealous, isn't that right? Because you suspected she was having an affair with your brother. I suspected they were committing fraud, which turned out to be true. But that's not all they were doing, is it? Shelton said, they were also engaged in a romantic relationship, weren't they? Helen immediately objected, and the judge sustained it. But the damage was done. Shelton had planted the seed, the idea that I was a scorned husband, that my motivations were personal rather than rational. For the rest of my testimony, Shelton tried to undermine my credibility. He suggested that I had access to Clara's accounts, that I could have transferred money without her knowledge. He suggested that I had motive, revenge, jealousy, the desire to protect my assets from a woman I suspected of infidelity. It was effective. I could see it in the jury's faces. Some of them were no longer sure. Some of them were wondering if maybe, just maybe, the real criminal was me. When I stepped down from the stand, I felt hollowed out. Helen had won the battle, but I wasn't sure we were winning the war. The prosecution called more witnesses, more FBI agents, more evidence. But then Clara took the stand in her own defense.
This was when everything changed. Clara was wearing a navy suit. She'd cut her hair shorter. She looked different, vulnerable in a way that was, I realized, completely calculated. She was performing a role, just as she'd performed every moment of our marriage. Her lawyer guided her through a story about how she'd been having financial problems, a story about how Nathan had suggested a way for her to get some money without bothering me, a story about how she didn't know that what they were doing was illegal, a story about how I'd become controlling and possessive, how I'd monitored her every move, how I'd threatened her if she tried to leave. None of it was true, but it was well constructed. It had the ring of truth. It had the emotional resonance that made juries believe. Then the prosecutor got her on cross-examination. Helen was methodical. She asked Clara about specific transactions. She asked her about the Miami trip. She asked her about the false identity she'd used when checking into the hotel. "That was my idea," Clara said. "I was scared. I thought Elias might try to find me." "You were scared he'd find you while you were in Miami to commit fraud?" Helen said. "I was scared of what he might do," Clara said. "He has a violent temper. He'd never let me leave." "But he did let you leave," Helen pointed out. "You left for a conference. You left for New York. He let you go." "Because he didn't know what I was planning," Clara said. Helen leaned forward. "Miss Holloway, I'm going to show you some text messages." Helen displayed the text messages on a screen for the jury, the ones where Clara had described the conference in Chicago, the keynote speaker, the fintech panel, the hot tub. "These messages," Helen said, "were sent from Miami." "I don't know what you mean," Clara said. "The metadata shows that these messages were sent from a cell tower in Miami," Helen continued. "Not Chicago, not from your hotel in Chicago. From Miami. How do you explain that?" Clara's face went very still. "My phone might have been somewhere else," she said. "But you were describing events at the Chicago conference," Helen said. "You said you were at a keynote speech. You said you were at a fintech panel. But you were actually in Miami. You were actually with your brother. You were actually committing fraud." The courtroom was completely silent. "I made a mistake," Clara said quietly. "You made several mistakes," Helen said, "but the biggest mistake was underestimating your husband. You assumed he wouldn't notice. You assumed he wouldn't care. You assumed that because you'd lied so smoothly before, you could keep lying. But he was watching. He was always watching, and he documented every single step you took." Helen turned to the judge. "I have no further questions." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. I waited in a small room with Helen and Detective Morris. We didn't talk much. There was nothing left to say. Everything had been said in the courtroom. The evidence had done its work. At 4:23 p.m., the jury returned. The foreman stood up. "Guilty on wire fraud. Guilty on conspiracy to commit fraud. Guilty on money laundering. All counts, both defendants." Clara's face went white. Nathan began to cry. Their lawyers immediately started calculating appeals, minimum sentences, possible reductions. But I wasn't listening to any of that. I was looking at Clara across the courtroom, and I realized something that I should have understood a long time ago. I had won. I had gotten the verdict. I had proved that I was right. And it didn't matter at all. The judge set sentencing for 2 weeks later. During those 2 weeks, I did something that surprised me. I hired a private investigator to look into Clara's past, into her family, into who she'd been before we met. What I discovered was that she'd always been this way. Her first boyfriend in college had accused her of draining his bank account. She'd denied it, and he dropped the charges. Her previous employer had suspected her of falsifying expense reports. She'd quit before they could investigate.
She was a serial liar, not because she was broken or damaged, but because she was smart. And she understood that most people were too lazy or too trusting to really look carefully. She'd just chosen the wrong person to betray. On sentencing day, Clara stood before the judge. She expressed remorse. She talked about her mistakes. She painted a picture of a woman who'd lost her way, who'd made bad choices, who deserved a second chance. The judge listened. Then he sentenced her to 7 years in federal prison. Nathan got 5 years. Marcus Chen, the accountant, got 3 years and 6 months. As the marshals led Clara away, she looked at me. For just a moment, our eyes met, and I saw something in her expression that I'd never seen before: understanding. She finally understood that I had outsmarted her, that I had been several moves ahead the entire time. I stood up and walked out of the courthouse into the cold Chicago afternoon. The wind was blowing off the lake. It was the kind of day that made the city feel like it was trying to shake off everything that had happened to it. I went to my office.
I looked at my empty desk. I thought about my empty house. I thought about the 7 years Clara would spend in prison. I thought about what it meant that I'd won, that I'd been right, that I'd successfully used every piece of knowledge I possessed to destroy 2 people who'd thought they could destroy me. And I realized that the victory felt like a loss. That night, I sold the house. I packed my things. I moved to a smaller apartment in a different part of the city. I kept the offshore accounts, the money, all of it, but I let go of everything else, the furniture, the art, the life that Clara had decorated. I also did something else. I donated $500,000 to a victims' rights organization, not to feel better about what had happened, but because I understood, finally, that my wife and brother were victims too. Not victims of me, but victims of their own greed, their own lack of discipline, their own belief that they could outsmart someone who'd spent his entire career understanding exactly how people like them think. It took 3 months for them to find the first body. Clara's cellmate at the federal detention facility noticed her acting strangely. She wasn't eating, she wasn't sleeping, she wasn't talking to anyone. She was just sitting on her bunk, staring at nothing. The prison psychologist recommended a psychiatric evaluation. Clara was placed on suicide watch, but on the 4th day, she managed to get a piece of glass from a broken window. She cut her wrist. By the time the guards found her, it was too late. I found out about it from Detective Morris, who called me to tell me the news. "I thought you should know," she said. "Thank you for calling," I said. "Are you okay?" she asked. I had to think about that for a moment. Was I okay? I wasn't sure anymore. I wasn't sure what okay meant. "I'm fine," I said finally. After I hung up, I went to my office, the small office in my new, smaller apartment, and I sat at my computer. I opened the file labeled Project Clarity, and I deleted everything. The monitoring data, the transaction records, the backup files, all of it gone. Then I did something else. I wrote a letter to the director of the federal prison where Nathan was incarcerated. I explained the circumstances of his imprisonment. I explained the fraud. I explained why he'd done it, and I recommended that he be released early, that he be given a second chance. Nathan was released after serving 30 months. The last I heard, he was working at a restaurant in Denver. He'd gotten married. He had a daughter. He'd built a life that had nothing to do with me, or with the money, or with any of the things that had led him to betray me in the first place. I don't know if he ever thought about what had happened between us. I don't know if he felt grateful that I'd recommended his release. I don't know if he understood that I'd done it for myself, not for him, because I needed to know that something good had come from all of this, that some part of my response had been about mercy rather than just cold, calculated revenge. The house where I live now is small. It has 1 bedroom, it has a kitchen, it has a living room. It doesn't have fancy art, it doesn't have expensive furniture, it doesn't have the kind of things that Clara would have decorated it with. I go to work, I do my job, I trace money through financial systems. I find the ways people try to hide what they don't want to be found. I'm very good at it. But I'm also different now. When I discover fraud, I don't immediately go to the authorities. I think about the person who committed it. I think about what led them to make that choice. I think about what would happen to their life if I exposed them. And sometimes I give them a chance to make it right before I report them. This has cost me professionally. Some of my colleagues think I'm soft. Some of my clients have found other forensic accountants who will pursue every angle, who won't give people second chances, who will move with the kind of ruthlessness that I've proven I'm capable of. But I've also discovered that there's a strange kind of peace in understanding that you don't have to use all of your power. You don't have to win every game. You don't have to prove yourself right in every situation. Clara died because she couldn't live with losing. Nathan survived because I decided he deserved to.
And I survive because I've learned that the trap is always the easiest part. It's the aftermath that teaches you who you really are. Every October, when the rain starts to fall in Chicago and the city begins to die, I think about that Tuesday afternoon when my phone pinged and my life changed. I think about the doorbell camera and the key sliding into the lock. I think about the moment when I understood that the people closest to me had chosen to betray me. And I don't feel sad about it anymore. I don't feel angry about it anymore. I just feel grateful that I was smart enough to see it coming. Because that's what I've learned. Betrayal is easy to see if you're willing to look carefully. The real skill isn't in being betrayed. The real skill is in knowing what to do with that knowledge once you have it. I chose to set a trap. I chose to wait. I chose to win. And in winning, I lost everything that mattered. So I spent the rest of my life trying to understand if that was a fair trade. I still haven't figured it out. But I know this. If Clara could see me now, sitting in my small apartment in Chicago, living a quiet life with a quiet job and quiet relationships, she would see a man who had everything he wanted when we were together. She would see that what she tried to take from me, the money, the security, the life I'd built, was never what I actually needed. And she would understand, finally, that the person she should have been afraid of wasn't the man with the forensic accounting skills and the offshore accounts. It was the man who was willing to wait 2 weeks, knowing exactly what his wife and brother were doing, playing the husband while building the case that would destroy them. The quiet ones are always the most dangerous. That's the real lesson. Not that you shouldn't betray people, not that you should be careful about committing fraud, but that the people who respond to betrayal with silence are the ones you should really worry about. Because silence is when they're preparing. Silence is when they're building their trap. Silence is when they're mapping out exactly how they're going to destroy you. And by the time you realize it, it's already too late. The doorbell camera recorded everything. I still have the footage. I watched it again recently, and I saw something I hadn't noticed before. In the moment before Clara went into my brother's apartment, she hesitated. She paused at the door. She looked over her shoulder toward the street, as if she sensed something, as if for just a moment she understood that someone was watching. But then Nathan called her from inside, and she turned back and went through the door, and the trap closed behind her.